I'm David Forster of the Bionutrient Food Association, and I'd like to introduce the next speaker, John Kemp. John is the founder of Advancing Eco-Ag and Agriculture, and they're doing some really excellent work on crop health management. He's works on large acreage internationally and is really pushing the bounds on understanding crop health management. So without further ado.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to be here. I'm just going to jump right into the topic of conversation. I'm assuming many of you, at least some of you, were here for the presentation yesterday. And so the topic of the discussion this morning is managing nutritional integrity using SAP analysis. So just as a brief backdrop, we believe, based on the experiences that we've had working with crops for disease management, disease resistance, immunity, fruit quality, etc., that nutritional integrity is at the foundation of all the things that we wish to achieve in producing extraordinarily healthy crops. So, in the research that I had done in the early years, as I was before I founded Advancing Eco-Agriculture, and in the years following that, I was able to read and find a tremendous body of research that correlated specific diseases with specific nutritional imbalances. There was plenty of literature to document that powdery mildew in cucurbit crops is directly associated with deficiencies of manganese, that apple scab is directly associated with deficiencies of cobalt, that, and I could continue with a really long list of different diseases with specific trace mineral deficiencies and other nutrient imbalances as well. And so in our work with farmers, we were using soil analysis and tissue analysis, dry matter-based tissue analysis, to evaluate the nutritional integrity of crops and then make adjustments in the growing season and between growing seasons to try to balance the nutritional profile. And after doing that for a 6-year period, we were becoming increasingly frustrated with tissue analysis, dry matter-based tissue analysis, because we were unable to identify any correlations between what was happening, the nutritional profiles in the SAP and the tissue analysis, and what was happening from a disease resistance perspective, and we were unable to draw any correlations between the nutritional profiles on the tissue analysis and crop performance and yield. Intensely frustrating. All the literature and all the research said there was a correlation, but we were not able to see a correlation in the laboratory data. And so, a number of years ago, I think it's 5 years ago now, I was expressing my frustrations to a group of consultants, and one of my mentors suggested that I connect with a group of people from the Netherlands who he had done some consulting work for, that had developed some very interesting technology that they were just simply referring to as plant sap analysis. And so we started experimenting with plant sap analysis. We have now used this technology for the last 4 years very intensely in our agricultural management systems and nutrition management systems. And for many of some of the most sophisticated farms that we work on, some of the most intense farms that we work on, sap analysis is one of the top 3 management decision-making tools that they use for crop management. Right partnered with irrigation. It's basically the top farms that are at the top of their class, top of performance, use 3 tools for making crop management decisions. They use irrigation management software, they use SAP analysis, and they use economics. Those 3 are the primary influencers that influence the decisions that they make in crop management in terms of the data that they have available to work with. So, we have used SAP analysis, and I'm incredibly passionate about this tool. I believe that until a better technology emerges, sap analysis is poised to completely displace the status quo of the current historical technology. And the reason for this is because sap analysis is so accurate, it is so sensitive, and it correlates perfectly to what we see happening in the field. In fact, it is so powerful that today we can use sap analysis and use a plant's nutritional profile to predict disease or insect susceptibility. That is incredibly powerful. We have never been able to do that before. To give you an example, this is the very first time that this happened for me. This was in 2013 growing season, if I recall correctly. We were working, one of our consultants was working with a hops ranch in Washington, one of the largest hops growers in the country. And at the end of the harvest season, the grower asked for a conference call to review all of their sap analysis data. So they had collected samples, usually from a crop management perspective. I'll describe this more in a bit, but we usually collect sap analysis samples every 2 weeks throughout the entire growing season, so that we have a very accurate picture and a very accurate map of what is happening throughout the growing season. So they had several hundred samples that they had collected over this growing season, and they wanted to sit down to do a thorough analysis, to look at the entire season, see, okay, what is happening, what have we learned, and what are we going to do differently next year as a result of what we have learned this year. So they sent me an email with all of the data on it minutes before the conference call, like 5 minutes in advance. And so we jumped onto the conference call. There were 5 people on the call. There were 3 people from the farm. There was Mike Turner, the ranch owner, Sam Turner, his son, and the operations manager, and their agronomist. And on our end was our consultant, Gary Redding, and myself. And so I started asking a bunch of questions to try to understand the data, what the different fields and varieties were, and also what nutrients that they had applied in their irrigation system and with foliar spray, so that I could better understand the fluctuations of what was happening and what was going on. And so right at the beginning of the call, the very first thing that I said, look guys, I know nothing about growing hops. I have zero experience with hops. I have never worked with them before. I have no idea what their nutritional requirements are. I have no idea what diseases and insects they're susceptible to. To the best of my knowledge, I've never seen a live hops plant in my life. And the ranch owner's response to that was, he said, well, between the 3 of us on our end of the conference call, we have a combined 81 years of experience growing hops. And we think that with our hops growing experience combined with your knowledge of plant nutrition and physiology, we should be able to figure it out. So I started asking a bunch of questions about what was trying to make sense of the data. And then about 15 minutes into the call, I said, okay, again, with the qualifier that I know nothing about hops, based on my understanding of nutrient interactions and similarities between the nutrient profiles that I'm seeing in hops and other crops that I'm familiar with, I would predict that this crop is very susceptible to either powdery or downy mildew, I'm not sure which one, but one of those 2, and white flies and spider mites. And there was dead silence on the phone. And then Mike said, well, maybe you know more about growing hops than we do. Because their top 3 pests were powdery mildew and white flies and spider mites. And I was able to see that based on the laboratory data of a plant's nutritional profile. Yes! That was a really, really big moment for me, because now we had, not only do we have the predictive capacity to predict disease or insect susceptibility based on a plant's nutritional profile, that means we also have the knowledge and the information, the tools to prevent that from happening. And that is a really big deal. That's very, very important. I believe that if we want to be successful in displacing pesticides on a large commercial scale fruit and vegetable production, then we have to have the tools that are accurate enough to prevent those problems from ever happening in the first place. So I want to describe some of the basic principles of sap analysis and how we use the information that we're getting to make management decisions, and how we interpret some of the data. It's impossible for me to cover all the nuance that is needed to be understood and how to interpret the data very deeply in a 1-hour presentation. We do have a day-long training, 8 hours of training that I've put together on how to interpret the data that is available from Crop Health Labs that I'll give you the address for in a moment. And so there's a lot of additional information available that you can access. And then I also want to share some stories about some of the things that we have learned with plant sap analysis and how we manage plant nutrition today very differently from the way we managed it 5 years ago before we were using sap analysis. Because what we have learned from this tool, this is a tool because of its sensitivity and because of its accuracy, it will show you in days whether a product is working or whether it is not working. And as a result, there are going to be some fertilizer companies that will love it and others that will intensely dislike it. And I can acknowledge this coming from a place, I'll share some of the stories. We had some products that we were using that we thought were very effective based on tissue analysis. And when we started using sap analysis, the needle did not move. And we had to completely change some of the products that we were using to get better crop responses. And we were able to get some exceptional crop responses as a result. So, looking at plant sap analysis, of course, if you want to manage plant health and manage a plant's nutritional integrity, you have to be able to monitor it. You can only manage what you can measure. And this is, I think, one of the biggest weaknesses of a lot of production agriculture currently, is that we have this giant blind spot and that we don't know what the nutritional integrity of our crops really are. Historically, particularly within the arena of biological and organic agriculture, the assumption was that we would use soil analysis and we would balance the minerals according to the soil test, and that would be good enough to grow a really healthy crop. Well, I'm here to tell you that it's not good enough. Many agronomists, the historical practice is to apply crop nutrients to try to balance the soil test. If the soil test is low in calcium, we add more calcium. If it's low in phosphorus, we add more phosphorus, etc., etc. And that is not incorrect, necessarily, but it is incomplete. I can tell you right now that none of you here in this room care about balancing a soil test so that you get a lab report that looks perfectly balanced. That's not what you care about. You care about growing a really healthy crop. That's what's important. The crop and the plant itself is the final report card. That's what we care about, and that is what we have to pay attention to. And you can have a perfectly balanced soil test and still have a crop that is extremely unhealthy. Mineral balance in the soil does not necessarily correlate with mineral balance in the plant. This strikes directly at the foundation of what many people would like to believe be true, that you have to have healthy soil to produce healthy plants. But what I can tell you is that in the soil profile, biology always trumps chemistry. Always. In other words, you can have a perfectly balanced soil test from a chemistry perspective, but if you have poor biology, your crop is not going to be healthy. And the counterpoint to that is that you can have a soil that is not perfectly balanced from a mineral profile, mineral chemistry perspective, but if you have really aggressive biology, that strong biology can overcome the imbalanced chemistry and you can still grow a healthy crop. Biology always trumps chemistry. So, to set some of the framework for understanding sap analysis, I'd like to talk a little bit about nutrient transport inside the plant. I don't remember this slide being positioned here, but I guess I'll talk about it now. So, plants move nutrients around using two types of transport tissue. You have phloem, which moves energy from the sugar source to the sink. So it moves sugars from the leaves to the plant sugar sinks, which I mentioned briefly yesterday. You have 3 sugar sinks. You have new growth at the top of the plant. You have root systems, and you have the fruit. Those are the 3 types of sugar sinks. And the phloem does not transport calcium or manganese. So calcium and manganese is usually not considered to be phloem mobile or to be mobile in plant structure. This is very important. And then the xylem tissue moves water. So just to give you a frame of reference, the phloem tissue, which moves sugar from the leaf to the fruit, this is a very thick, syrupy liquid. 75% sugar content. It's the equivalent of honey almost. Extremely thick, extremely syrupy solution. The xylem transport is water transport. It moves water from the root system up to the upper part of the plant, and it transports nutrients in association with that. And since calcium and manganese are not translocated in the phloem, this means that we need a constant supply of calcium and manganese every single day. On the day that calcium and manganese is not being supplied, the new growth at the top of the plant or the fruit, wherever the water flow is going, has the potential to become deficient. So, in plants, we have a 24-hour photocycle, 24-hour photoperiod, where sugars are being produced in the leaves and then being moved to these various sugar sinks. The reason this is important, the reason I'm talking about this, is so that we can understand nutrient movement and nutrient transport within the plant. So, the points of optimal nutrition. The plant will do everything in its power, everything in its capacity, to keep the new leaves at the new growth shoots perfectly balanced with nutrition. It will sabotage other parts of the plant to keep optimal nutrients at the new growth. And this is during the framing stage, during vegetative stages. And then during the fruit fill stage, reproductive stages, the optimal growth nutrient point is the fruit. At this point, it will now sabotage older leaves. It will also sabotage new leaves to fill fruit. So, how many of you are familiar with the Mulder chart of nutrient interactions? A number of you have seen it before. How many of you have memorized it? There's a lot of complex interactions that are described with the Mulder chart. This chart is very accurate and very detailed. And from a practical on-farm management perspective, the consulting team that developed SAP analysis in the Netherlands developed an alternate chart to describe nutrient interactions that they were seeing happening in plant sap that we have revised and adapted. It is not perfect. It is not as accurate as this chart is, but it is much more practical from a management perspective to really understand it very easily and very quickly. So, to give you a frame of reference about what we're comparing, the historical status quo with tissue analysis was that you would collect leaf samples from the last fully mature leaf on the plant. You send them to a laboratory. At the laboratory, they're completely dehydrated and ashed. And then the nutrient content of that ash is measured and reported as a percentage of a dry matter on a dry matter basis. Total percentage of dry matter, or parts per million within that dry matter. And plant sap analysis is radically different in that you collect leaf samples from two locations on the plant, from the last fully mature leaf, the last new leaf, and also from the oldest leaf on the plant, the oldest leaf that is still green and vitally growing. You send these two samples to the laboratory separately, and they extract the sap out of the leaf without dehydrating the leaf at all. So there is no dehydration. They're simply collecting the sap out of that leaf, and then they're measuring the nutrient content of that sap. So there is a lot of science that we could go into describing how this process came to be, more than we have the luxury of time to discuss right now. But very simply, it's very important that the sap be collected from the leaves and not from the petiole. The leaves are the factory, the petiole is the nutrient transport pipeline. And that nutrient transport pipeline has constant fluctuation of nutrients in every 24-hour photoperiod as sugar is moving back and forth and as nutrients are moving in and out. It does not make sense to measure the petioles. So, I'd like to go back for just a moment before we describe this chart. With sap analysis, we measure new and old. And on a number of crops, we're actually looking at measuring a third parameter as well, where we're measuring the middle part of the plant also. But for right now, we're measuring new and old. And remember what I said earlier, plants will do everything in their power to keep the new growth at optimum nutrition, which means that they will sabotage old growth, or if they have a surplus, they will store the surplus in the old leaves. So what this means is this incorporates what I refer to as differential testing. So we can now look at the differential, and many of these nutrients are very mobile, and we can look at the differential between new and old to see what that plant's desired values are. So the team in the Netherlands developed this chart, which we then revised. And if you look at it, this chart is positioned into four quadrants. On the left side of the chart, we have all the cations, the positively charged elements. On the right side, we have all the anions, the negatively charged elements. The upper half, we have all of the macronutrients, the major elements. And on the lower half, we have all of the micronutrients and trace minerals. And you can find this chart as well as a YouTube clip describing more about it on our website at advancingecoag.com or on crophealthlabs.com. So what the team in the Netherlands described is within soil systems, we understand that each soil has a finite mineral holding capacity. We call it CEC, cation exchange capacity. We understand that each soil can only hold so many cations and so many anions. And we haven't used that same system of thinking for when we think about plant cells. And yet, it is logical that each cell also has a finite mineral holding capacity. So what they identified is that for all the macronutrients, all the major elements, then we have all of these cations, calcium, potassium, magnesium, sodium, and ammonium, that antagonize each other. In other words, there is a bucket, 100% capacity. When that bucket is filled, it cannot hold any more. And so if you have an excess of one of these elements, let's say you have an excess of potassium, that excess of potassium can create a deficiency of calcium, or it can create a deficiency of magnesium. And guess what? You can't fix that deficiency by spraying on more calcium. It doesn't work. You don't have a calcium deficiency problem, you have a potassium excess problem. And this goes back to the point in the comment that I made yesterday, that what we have observed since we've started using SAP analysis is historically our thinking as farmers and nutrient managers, agronomists, has always been that we need to apply the excess, or apply the deficiencies. And with SAP analysis, we're uncovering that that is not true. We need to apply the antidote to the excesses and allow the deficiencies to correct themselves on their own. So this same holds true as well for the anions. You have nitrate, sulfur, chloride, and phosphorus. And an excess of any one of these elements can create deficiencies of any of the others. Then we have some interesting synergistic relationships diagonally across the chart between phosphorus and zinc, for example, and the other direction between calcium and boron. So when we look at nutrient mobility, going back to talking about differential testing, nutrient mobility, there are 4 nutrients, potassium, or NPK, and magnesium, that are considered highly mobile. They move around inside the plant structure in minutes or hours or days, very, very quickly. Wherever the plant needs them, they're moved around. And then, in addition to those 4, these additional nutrients, and for the sake of this conversation, I'm simply focusing on the major elements, the macronutrients. The trace minerals are another conversation in and of themselves entirely. Then we also have sodium and sulfur and chloride, which are considered moderately mobile. They're not highly mobile, they don't move around as fast, but they do move around inside the plant system. So what that means is all of these nutrients across the top half of the chart, all the cations and the anions, all these nutrients, with the exception of calcium, are very mobile and can move around in plant systems. Calcium is not mobile because it cannot be moved by phloem transport, which I pointed out earlier. So all the remainder of these nutrients can move around, and we can test and measure the differential between the new leaves and the old leaves. So, I'd like to tell you the story of tomato production. When we first started using SAP analysis, one of the areas that we did a lot of work in was in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, Amish community, and the Mennonites, and down into Maryland as well. And in this community, we work at that moment, we were working with about 400 growers, and it's quite a bit more than that today. But we were working with many tomato growers who were growing tomatoes in greenhouses and in high tunnels, as well as outdoors. And just to give you a frame of reference, these soils in the Lancaster County region are limestone-based soils. They have extremely high pHs, extremely high calcium levels, and they have more livestock manure than they know possibly what to do with. So there is a generous amount of manure application on every acre, every year, year after year. And the result is that they have soils which have extremely high levels of calcium, extremely high levels of potassium, extremely high levels of phosphorus, and the plants are starving for all three, because they have excesses to the point where they are actually creating tie-ups so that the plants cannot absorb them. In addition, because of having calcareous soils and high soil pHs, they had severe problems with manganese deficiencies, and we were constantly addressing manganese. So 5 years ago, before we were using sap analysis, in these tomato crops, we understood that when tomatoes begin filling fruit, they have extremely high potassium requirements to fill fruit because we have all this sugar transport moving in, and we have very high potassium requirements. So many of these farms that we were working with were irrigating as much as 3 gallons per acre per week of liquid potassium to supply the crop's potassium requirements. Tremendous amount. Usually we're applying quarts per acre. And these plants were using a tremendous amount of potassium. The soil was supplying almost, even though they had soil that had 250 to 300 parts per million potassium, double the amount that you would be considered a required amount, these crops were not getting any appreciable amount of potassium from the soil profile at all. So, at the same time, to address the manganese problem, we were using foliar applications of manganese sulfate because it was inexpensive and it was readily available, and a lot of growers could access it locally. So we would use foliar applications of manganese sulfate, and when we were using tissue analysis, the manganese numbers would increase, and we thought the problem was fixed. When we started using sap analysis, and we put on foliar applications of manganese sulfate, the manganese number did not change. It stayed exactly the same. The manganese was landing on the leaf surface, but it was not successfully getting into the leaf and being used inside the leaf and inside the plant. So that led us down a very deep rabbit hole of trying to understand exactly how plants absorb manganese and how to most effectively get manganese into the plants. And this is where we got into an entire conversation about oxidation, reduction, the different oxidation states of these various metals, and also the different chelates, the different forms of chelation. So after several weeks of very intense experimentation and development, we finally found some research that had very extensive research on chelation and how to get manganese into plants. And we ended up actually developing a product that was a manganese chelate to rapidly move this mineral into plants. We started putting on foliar applications of a manganese chelate instead of manganese sulfate. And the manganese numbers changed quickly and rapidly and drastically on the sap analysis. Just to give you a frame of reference, the desired value on tomatoes is in the neighborhood of about 40 to 60 parts per million. And prior to this, we were in the neighborhood of 5 to 8 to 10 parts per million. The plants were very deficient. We put on manganese sulfate. We got zero response at all. And then we put on the liquid manganese chelate, and we went from 5 parts per million to 50 parts per million in a matter of 24 to 48 hours. Tremendous crop response. But then something else happened. All of a sudden, the potassium numbers came up all on their own. And we discovered by some experimentation that by whatever mechanism that we didn't know about and we were not able to find any references in the literature for this mechanism, but manganese serves to function as the potassium regulator, as the potassium thermostat inside the plant. It will both upregulate and downregulate potassium absorption and potassium translocation within the plant. So the result was that when we fixed the manganese problem, the potassium problem took care of itself. Just to give you an idea of what this meant, we used to sell liquid potassium into this distributor, into this marketplace by the semi-truckload every year, dozens of tanker loads. And in 1 year, from 2012 to 2013, the use of liquid potassium for tomato production in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania dropped by 90%. Because they were able to fix their problems with a few quarts per acre of liquid manganese. Fix their potassium problem. So, this was a very powerful story because we learned about nutrient interactions that we were not aware of before. But more importantly, we saved these farmers a tremendous amount of money, and we made them a lot of money by producing a much healthier crop. So, to give you an example, I wanted to show you what sap analysis looks like. And this screen is pretty far away, but this is an example of what a report looks like. So, on every report, you have both new leaves and old leaves side by side on the same report. So you can look at the differential and measure exactly what is happening. So in this, we have new leaves at the top and old leaves at the bottom. Can you guys halfway back, can you even see this at all? You can? Okay. So let's look at potassium as an example, which is the fourth line down. And here we have potassium, new leaves at the top, 4,770 parts per million. New leaves, I said that wrong. New leaves at the top, 4,770. So these would be new leaves 4 feet off the ground. Old leaves down at the bottom of the plant are 4,830 parts per million. So, I don't know anything about this tomato variety. I have no idea what their nutritional requirements are. I don't need to know. Because this plant is telling me that it has an adequate supply of potassium, it doesn't need any more. Why? Because it has a slight surplus. Remember, it wants to keep the perfect balance at the new growth. And it has a slight surplus, so it's putting that surplus in the old leaves at the bottom. So we have 100 parts per million more, or 50 parts per million more potassium at the bottom leaves than we do at the top. That's it. That's all I need to know. It doesn't matter. I don't care where this bar graph is. I don't care about the bar graph. The plant is telling me it has enough. So, you can do what I just described for potassium. You can do for nitrogen, for potassium, for phosphorus, and for magnesium, as well as for all the other major elements, with the exception of calcium. You cannot do that for calcium because calcium is not a mobile element and does not move around in that way. So now, this is at the foundation of why I was able to sit down with 200 sap analysis from a hops grower, and I knew nothing about hops. I didn't know what their nutritional requirements were, and I didn't need to know, because the plants were able to tell me what was happening and what was going on. This is an incredibly powerful tool, because what we are learning, and this is a whole other conversation in and of itself, but what we are learning is that in some cases, when you have varieties that have been bred very differently for very different characteristics, they have very different nutritional requirements. So there are some strawberry varieties which require 60% more nitrogen and 50% less phosphorus than another variety on the exact same soil type. And so we're able to customize the nutrients on large commercial operations on a variety by variety basis to get the optimal results. All of a sudden, we are no longer dependent on historical laboratory guidelines or data for a desired value. We're no longer dependent on a predetermined desired value, because we're giving the plants the opportunity to be expressive and to talk to us. So, this is the bottom half of this leaf look like. So, then, another story that happened from sap analysis is a number of years ago, before we were using sap analysis, we uncovered that apple scab is correlated with cobalt deficiencies, and that when we address cobalt, the apple scab incidence is tremendously reduced and in many cases completely disappears. So this is actually a picture of Gala apples actually this is in central Pennsylvania. These are Gala apples about 16 months after we started working with this orchard for the very first time. The year before this harvest, 100% of their Gala apple harvest went for cider and processing. They had no fruit that qualified for fresh market because the fruit were covered with apple scab. We worked with them with foliar applications to address cobalt and calcium and all the other nutrients that were imbalanced for a year prior with foliar applications. And the following year, after working with those trees for 1 year, the following year, we had no scab problems at all. This is a certified organic orchard. There's no scab treatments being sprayed onto this crop. And they have no scab on a very susceptible variety. When we started using sap analysis several years after this discovery, we discovered that there was one very distinct difference between scab-resistant varieties and scab-susceptible varieties. The scab-resistant varieties were genetically much better at absorbing cobalt from the soil profile. They could be planted onto the same soil, same difference, but same profile, but the resistant varieties were genetically much more capable of absorbing cobalt and had higher cobalt levels in the plant sap, even though they were planted onto the same soil. Then, following our experience with tomatoes and discovering the link between manganese and potassium regulation, we encountered another very interesting challenge with crops that hyperaccumulated potassium. So there are several examples of crops that tend to hyperaccumulate potassium. Honeycrisp apples are one. Bell peppers are another. So many of you may be familiar with problems of bitter pit or corking or blossom end rot. Blossom end rot on peppers, sidewall rot on peppers, blossom end rot on tomatoes. Many times, it is well understood that these are problems of calcium deficiency inside the fruit, where we don't have enough calcium in the fruit. And yet, particularly on peppers and honeycrisp apples, farmers could apply tremendous quantities of calcium in irrigation systems, on the soil, and through foliar applications, and get very minimal or even no crop response. It didn't fix the problem. And the reason it didn't fix the problem is because it was not a calcium deficiency problem. It was a potassium excess problem that was creating a calcium deficiency. So what happened is these plants genetically hyperaccumulated potassium to extremely high concentrations, and they prevented calcium from moving into the fruit. So just to give you an example, these are Honeycrisp apples. This is a test from Honeycrisp. So potassium levels. Here we see potassium levels, 6,000 parts per million on the new leaves, 5,200 on the old. So if you look at the ratio, that ratio is telling us it has higher potassium on the new than it does on the old, and so that means it would utilize even more potassium. It would push even more potassium in if it were accessible and if it were available. Just to give you a frame of reference, most apple varieties will self-regulate and self-balance somewhere in the neighborhood of about 3,200 to 3,500 parts per million. So these plants are double that, and they're still going. And I have seen Honeycrisp sap analysis as high as 9,000 to 10,000 parts per million potassium. And they're still trending upward. And as a result of that, the calcium levels here are 398 and 1,500 parts per million. And ideally, they should be 2,000 to 2,500. So this is a crop that is experiencing a calcium deficiency as a result of a potassium excess. And here is where our experience with manganese and potassium came in very useful. Because now we ask the question, okay, we've discovered by accident that manganese has the capacity to upregulate potassium absorption. Does it also have the capacity to downregulate potassium absorption? We started experimenting with foliar applications of manganese and increasing the manganese concentrations in Honeycrisp apples and in bell peppers. And surprise, surprise, manganese also downregulates and suppresses the absorption of excessive potassium. So all of a sudden, the potassium levels went down, the calcium levels went up, and we fixed the bitter pit problem, and we fixed blossom end rot, and we fixed sidewall rot by applications of manganese instead of by applications of calcium. So, again, when we uncovered the root cause of the problem, all of a sudden it becomes a lot of fun to work with these systems. So then the next piece, the next story, is on cherry production. And this is where it kind of really all came together, this interaction between calcium and potassium and manganese. So in cherry production, we're working with a very sophisticated and very talented cherry grower in the Pacific Northwest who uses sap analysis very intensely to manage his crops and does an extraordinary job. So, in my next, based on a comment that we had yesterday, in my next presentation this afternoon, I'm going to take some time to deliberately show some of the successes and some of the pictures that we've experienced on some of these operations, just to give you a frame of reference. Well, I'll show you in just a moment, but these cherries are averaging 8.5 to 8 row cherries, and what that means, that's a sizing rule that is used for cherry production. So we're looking at a cherry size that is approximately 1.25 inches to 1 3/8 inches in diameter. So roughly the size of a pullet's egg. So very large cherries, very firm cherries. So their target is they want very large cherries, they want firm cherries, and they want sweet cherries. So this is the sizing rule that we're looking at. You can see 79/64 is 8.5 row cherry. So when we first started working with Mike, one of his standard practices was to do a foliar application of 5 pounds per acre of triple 20 once per week during the early development stage. And so starting at bud break, every week, 5 pounds per acre of triple 20 as a part of his nutrition system. And actually, let me back up and just set the stage for just a moment. So in embryo development, and this is true for any fruit, I don't care if you're growing grain, corn, soybeans, apples, peppers, cherries, tomatoes, it is all the same. After blossoming, or at pollination, basically at pollination, for the next 10 to 14 days after pollination, that embryo is going to go through what is called the cell division phase. So all these cells are multiplying very rapidly, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, and so forth, where you have this extremely rapid cell multiplication. And then, at the end of that 10 to 14 day period, cell division largely stops and gets cut off. It's 95% cut off. There is, for all practical purposes, there is no further cell division for the rest of the growing season to harvest. For the remainder of the growing season, it now switches to cell expansion, where each of those cells is filled with water and sugar and nutrients. So each of those cells expand. That's what's called the fruit fill period. So you first have 2 weeks of cell division, then you have cell expansion. Now, the reason this is important is because in the first 2 weeks, the critical nutrient is calcium, because calcium is needed to form all of those cell membranes and make sure that we have high-quality cell membranes. So the more calcium that can move into that embryo in the first 2 weeks, the more cells can be formed and the higher quality those cells are going to be. So that is going to determine your potential future fruit size and your potential future fruit quality. So shell thickness on a pepper, firmness, fruit firmness, all of this is related to calcium in that first 2 week window. Then, after that 2 week window, it switches. Now, the critical nutrient is no longer calcium, it is now potassium. Why potassium? Because potassium is the locomotive that pushes and moves sugar from the leaves during the photosynthetic factory into the fruit. So we need potassium to move sugars and to move water and to move all these nutrients into the fruit. So the potassium requirement goes up tremendously when we get to the fruit fill stage. So first 2 weeks, dominant nutrient is calcium. Rest of the fruit fill period, dominant nutrient is potassium. Everything that I've told you so far is standard industry knowledge by all the major fruit and vegetable growers. They know this intuitively. I haven't told you anything that isn't new, that is new at this point. But the interesting part that is new is this understanding that calcium and potassium antagonize each other. So what has been happening is that growers have started with potassium applications early, during or even before the cell division stage. And this potassium application early prevented calcium from moving into the embryo in that 2 week window and created a calcium deficiency within the fruit. That is the cause of blossom end rot. That is the cause of bitter pit. That is the cause of cork. What I can tell you right now, unequivocally, 80+% of all fruit quality problems, storage problems, firmness, you name it, 80% of all fruit quality problems is a direct result of not managing the relationships between calcium and potassium in this 2-week window correctly. You figure that out, and everything else clicks beautifully. So, coming back to Mike Omeg, and what we had learned in our understanding of cell division and cell expansion, and calcium and potassium interactions, and manganese, we said, Mike, you have to stop the 20/20 foliar applications at the bud break period. And you cannot put on 20/20 because 20/20 contains potassium. You can't put on any 20/20 until you get to the cell expansion stage. Mike thought we were going to ruin his orchard. It was extremely difficult for him to even consider giving up the use of 20/20. So, the first year, he did a test. He took one of his blocks, he has 370 acres of cherries, he took one 10-acre block and split it in half and on half of it, 3.5 acres, he took out the 20/20. That was all that he dared to do. He took off the 20/20. Here's what happened. This is the section without the 20/20. Potassium levels are 4,600 parts per million in the new and 4,710 in the old. You have about 100 parts per million differential. That shows that we still have a surplus in the old leaves. So this plants are telling us they still have an adequate supply of potassium. Even though the bar graph is below the desired range, middle of the chart, it's still showing us that the plant is telling us it has enough potassium and it doesn't need any more. If you look at the calcium levels, calcium is 680 and 650 parts per million. Now, on the block that got potassium, that got the 20/20, potassium levels were 7280 and 7390. Not quite double, they were 70% higher. And calcium levels are 534 and 763. Now, in the old leaves, they're actually higher. But because calcium is not mobile, it's not moving into the new leaves and into the fruit. And on the new leaves, it's actually substantially less. So it dropped from 656, it dropped all the way down to 534. So, those numbers might not, on the calcium numbers, those numbers might not seem that substantial. But here's what happened in the fruit. So remember, in cherries, they get paid for fruit based on size. The larger the cherry, the higher the price per pound. It's a very simple linear equation. On cherry size, on this block, the blue is the side that had no 20/20. So it's difficult to see, but whoops, back up here. On the far left-hand column, we have 9 rows. This is 9 row size, 9.5, 10, 10.5 row size. And the blue is the side without the 20/20. The red is the side with the 20/20. So the red, we had the majority of the cherries be a 10 row and more in the 10.5 row, and we had some in the 9.5. So on average, and the blue side, we had much higher 9 row, substantially higher 9.5 row, and then less 10 row. We basically moved most of the fruit up by half a row size. Just doing that one thing, resulted in increased revenue of $1,664 per acre with taking something out, not putting something in. That was it. So, there are many, many more pieces that I could talk about, but I just focus on this one interaction and what we have learned about it and how we have learned to understand it with the use of sap analysis. And there is so much more that I could talk about it in terms of disease resistance and insect resistance. But I want to open it up for any questions that you might have. So, there's a few more points that I wanted to address just briefly. Today, and with this group, the Bionutrient Food Association, there is a lot of discussion about nutrient density. And I have a surprise for you. When you have perfectly balanced nutrition, it means that you have lower mineral concentrations inside the plant and inside the fruit. And this came as a surprise for us. we were tracking sap analysis every 2 weeks on these farms. On some crops that are very intense, very short season, like salad greens and lettuce, where we have a 6-week crop window, we would measure them every week. And we observed a number of occasions where we had a crop where the nutrition was pretty much balanced exactly where it needed to be, and everything was moving really well, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 nutrients. Maybe magnesium and phosphorus were not where they needed to be. So we would put on a foliar application of magnesium and phosphorus, and in the next test, all the nutrients across the board would drop by 30 to 40% in concentration. And if you looked at the lab report and you just looked at the data, you'd say, what on earth is happening here? But if you look at the plants, what is happening with the plants is that you address magnesium and phosphorus, and those are the 2 nutrients holding the plant back, and all of a sudden photosynthesis just steps up to 2 gears higher, and you get this flush of plant growth, and you get tremendous biomass very, very quickly. So essentially what is happening is that you are diluting out the nutrient concentrations with a larger volume of plant biomass. And that plant biomass is extremely healthy. This is not the equivalent of what happens when you put on an application of nitrogen. This is extremely healthy plants. They're resistant to diseases, they're resistant to insects, and they have a lower concentration of calcium and potassium and phosphorus and everything else than the less healthy plant did, the less balanced plant did. But they have substantially higher concentrations of secondary metabolites, anthocyanins, resveratrol, polyphenolic compounds, terpenoids, sesquiterpenes, bioflavonoids, etc. All of those secondary metabolites are in a much higher concentration in these plants that have perfectly balanced nutrition. So when we talk about nutrient density and nutrient-dense foods, I think we need to be very careful how we define nutrient density. Nutrient density is not just about mineral density. Mineral density is important. Mineral balance is more important. But most importantly of all is how these plants are expressing themselves from the perspective of these secondary metabolites. So, this afternoon, my presentation this afternoon, one of the pieces that I want to talk about is I want to show a bunch of pictures of some of the results that we have seen and what actually happens in the field when you achieve balanced nutrition and how plants respond, because many of us don't recognize anymore what extremely healthy crops look like. We have accepted, or we have become familiar with plants that have suboptimum nutrition and a suboptimum environment, and when we work on changing that and we measure it and we manage it very well, that we can achieve results that are much bigger than what most of us would even imagine. So I'll stop there, and I'll open it up for any questions that you have. We have a microphone here. And also, while we get to the first question, I should also comment, I'm going to be around here for the rest of the day to answer any questions. And in addition to myself, we also have Harold Schrock, who's one of our staff consultants from AEA. He lives in New York, works with many of the New England states. He is here as well. Harold is sitting here in the back. And if I'm busy, you're welcome to talk with him as well. Also, if you want more information on anything that I've talked about, we are working very hard to organize our information, things that I've talked about and have written about, and put them all on our website. So advancingecoag.com, you can find a lot of the information that we've been working with. Yes?
Thank you. That was really fascinating. Had me at the edge of my chair. I have so many questions, but the one I guess I'll ask is the most recent in your presentation towards the cherry production and the cherry management system that you worked on. You mentioned so you just described very eloquently the antagonism between calcium and potassium. Your grower was putting down the triple 20, and so based on your earlier examples, are we supposed to assume that he also had a manganese system in place, or were you guys doing more than just telling him to stop doing this? Were you also pushing trace mineral applications,
yes,
etc.?
Really great question. So This happened in the very first year that we worked with this farm. We just started going through the transition process of getting to a more biological system. And so historically, before that moment when we started working with him, historically, he would apply very strong zinc applications with no manganese. So we changed that, not on this trial block, but then on other blocks and other sections of the farm. And today, he's addressing manganese and minimizing the amount of zinc. And so where he is today, we do address manganese consistently on a continual basis to make sure that we have an adequate supply. And in addition, he used to buy triple 20 by the tractor trailer load. He hasn't bought any triple 20 in the last 3 years. So we did both of those things. Did that answer your question?
Yes, always foliar trace.
Yes, so I addressed this briefly yesterday. All of the trace mineral metals, with the exception of zinc, so manganese and iron and copper and cobalt, from a nutritional perspective, in our opinion, always need to be addressed by foliar means rather than by soil means until you correct soil biology. Because the problem is that these minerals, when they're applied to soil, tend to convert to an oxidized form that plants cannot utilize unless you have very aggressive biology. And most of the farms that we work with today, 90% of the farms that we work with when we first start working with them, do not have good soil biology. And we find that in that situation, in that context, soil-applied trace minerals are a waste of money. They do not deliver crop results. Yes?
I've heard many things about liquid calcium foliar sprays. And many of them are contradictory, and I would like to know your thoughts on liquid calcium sprays, because I've heard calcium is too big to be absorbed by the stomata. It's actually when it falls on the ground that it's uptaken, and I've heard many, many, many different things. Can I have 2 minutes of your thoughts on liquid calcium foliar sprays, please?
For the benefit of the other people who ask questions, I'll try to reduce the answer to about 15 seconds. So, very simply, calcium can be absorbed by the leaves. However, it is not translocated from the leaves into fruit unless it is chelated. It can be chelated with amino acids, with organic acids, and with various other chelation agents so that it is mobile and does move around in the plant. So when you have calcium in a chelated form, you can absolutely have it be absorbed by the leaves and be translocated to the fruit, and it does work. And you also need to, of course, address the potassium problem first. Yes, go ahead.
Hi. So I just need help with the interpretation part, because I feel like I could walk out of here today, I could go home, and I could take the fresh leaf, and I could take the oldest leaf, and I could try to do that. And I see your chart where you have the new and the old. The gap in knowledge that I have right now is I don't know how to interpret. Like you showed the bar graphs, and could you briefly, like when you compare a new leaf to an old leaf, what are you looking for to determine if it's like a good result or a bad result?
Thank you. Plants will do everything they can to keep the new growth perfect. So, if you have, let's say, a tomato, and the new growth at the top is 3,000 parts per million potassium, and the old growth is 4,000. The old leaves are 4,000. That plant is telling us it has a surplus. It has more potassium than it needs to keep the new growth perfect, so it's storing the surplus downstairs in the old leaves. If you have the opposite, if you have 3,000 parts per million at the top and you now have 2,000 at the bottom, that plant is telling us it has a deficiency, and it's sabotaging the old leaves, and it's pulling the potassium out of the old leaves at the bottom, and it's moving them up to the top. This is the root cause of early blight. Early blight is not caused by alternaria, it's caused by a potassium deficiency. When potassium moves out of the older leaves and moves up into the fruit, then you get early blight at the bottom. And as proof of that, a very simple proof of that, first of all, it can be completely prevented with potassium applications. But secondly, what disease do you know that infects only certain parts of the plant? Early blight will infect the leaves back to the main stem, and boom, it shuts off. Have you ever seen early blight infect a tomato stem? No, because it's not a disease, it's a potassium deficiency. What the plant has done is has pulled the potassium out, and it has shut off communication with that leaf. I could talk more about that, but...
I have 5,000 square feet under cultivation. I have 5 apple trees and 3 peach trees and so forth.
It's not practical.
Well, I'm not trying to sell anything. I'm trying to feed my family.
Yep.
But the question is, what advice do you have for a person who is basically small scale?
So there's many different definitions of small scale. We actually had a question. This question came up yesterday in the chat, and Harold gave me some good input. He had done the math, which I had not done, multiple different ways to understand where is the economic threshold for sap analysis. So if you're doing sap analysis every 2 weeks throughout the growing season, where's the value threshold that you actually make money and can make more money than what you're spending with sap analysis? And he identified that threshold, or actually not make money on crop value, but just saved input costs with potassium applications and so forth. And he identified that threshold as being at $5,000 of crop value. And that is wholesale crop value, so not retail value. So to answer your question, it is possible in some environments and some conditions to pick indicator species and use one indicator species and manage the rest to that. With that being said, many species have radically different nutritional requirements. Tomatoes and peppers are both in the solanaceous family. Tomatoes have extremely high potassium requirements because they're filling a solid fruit. Peppers accumulate excessive potassium because they're a hollow shell. So the sad but best answer that I have at the moment is I don't see sap analysis as being a practical tool for really small-scale growers at this point.
Go
ahead.
Excuse me. So how do I get my hands on chelated micro metals, or is there like a home technique
easy.
Other than compost?
You call advancing eco-agriculture and your problem is fixed. No, I'm being partially facetious and partially being serious. I'm not here at the BFA and giving a presentation to do a sales pitch. But there was a very real reason why we created our own line of liquid trace minerals, because we couldn't find one anywhere else. So I'm sure this was 4 years ago, or 3-4 years ago when we first really started developing our own line of liquid trace minerals. There might be others available in the marketplace right now that I'm not aware of. But you need to look for a liquid chelate that is chelated with an organic acid or an amino acid. So when you have that, you can get plant absorption up very quickly. So I've been given the signal to shut down, so I will be here for the rest of the day. I'm going to be walking around. I will be in a few other presentations as well, but feel free to stop me, talk to me, ask any questions, ask Harold, and I look forward to seeing you again this afternoon.
Can I say, if you want, it's lunch next, so if you want to go on and you don't mind missing lunch for another 5 minutes or 10, we could do it.
That works for me.
You alluded to the cost in the ratio of size to cost. Can you recommend a lab, and could you talk about the logistics? How much does it cost, and what are we looking at for an average size farm to do this?
Great question. Thanks for, I should have mentioned that. So today, there are about a dozen labs all over the world that have experimented and have tried to develop sap analysis. There is only one of them that has been able to develop consistent, repeatable data. And that is a laboratory in the Netherlands, and the way they've been able to do that is develop a proprietary extraction process they don't want the rest of the world to know. And so that laboratory in the Netherlands is called Nova Crop Control. Today, at this moment in time, and this could change in the very near future, but at this moment in time, we run a virtual lab in Ohio called Crop Health Labs. You can go online, find them, crophealthlabs.com. They have a website. And so what we are doing today is we are aggregating samples from all the growers all over North America. They are shipped to our location in Ohio. We package all of them together, and we overnight express them to the Netherlands, where the analysis is done in the Netherlands, and the results are reported by email. And usually when the samples, the lab in the Netherlands has made a commitment that when the samples arrive, they turn the process around in 24 hours. So for the grower is usually getting results back 5 to 7 days after they pull the sample. And because it is so sensitive and so accurate, one of the things that I failed to mention is that it shows us nutrient deficiencies 3 to 4 weeks earlier than tissue analysis will. So we have a tremendous lead time to actually make changes that can change the crop and prevent problems. So to answer your question about cost, this is not a number that I know off the top of my head, but the samples are sold in sets. So you don't buy one sample, you always buy two, old and new together. And the laboratory runs thousands of samples per day during the peak season. And so they have basically forced everyone to adapt to their ecosystem. They said, we cannot possibly manage the logistics of entering every farm's information and field data and so forth during the peak rush season. We don't have the time, we don't have the resources, it's not going to work. So they sell a set of samples for a field for a year. So let's say you have a tomato field and you expect the season to be 20 weeks long. At the beginning of the year, you connect with Crop Health Labs or with one of our consultants at Advancing Eco Agriculture, and you order 10 sets of samples with the field name and the variety name and the farm name and the consultant name and everything automatically included into the form. You send that to the laboratory, and you get billed in advance for the entire season. They charge you in advance for the entire season, and then they send you a kit of barcoded labels that is connected to that field and that variety. So during the growing season, you collect the samples, you put them into plastic Ziploc bags, you put a barcoded label on them, and when they get to the lab, they scan the barcode and they instantly populates all the information. So it streamlines their process a lot. So since they sell them in sets in fairly large volumes, they offer volume discounts. There's breaks at greater than 10, greater than 25, and greater than 50, if I recall correctly, sets. And I think, I'm a bad one to answer this question, but if I recall correctly, the 25 and greater samples is at $55 per set. So it costs you, Harold, can you help me out here? What's the cost per field per year? So $450? $450 to do one field unit. So is that one tomato height tunnel, or is it a 10-acre field of tomatoes? That's going to vary cost per acre. Yes? Oh, go ahead.
You said that during reproductive growth, fruit fill takes precedence at the expense of new growth. So does that change how you interpret the results during fruit fill?
You're entirely too sharp. I was trying to keep it simple. So, the answer is maybe. We don't know for sure. What we do know is that, and so one of the things that we look for, and this is a whole other conversation tied to the discussion that we had yesterday about critical points of influence, is that one of the ways we measure plant energy during the fruit fill stage is we monitor the new shoots. So on a cherry tree or an apple tree, for example, or a blueberry bush, we want that new shoot to be constantly growing. We do not want it to set the terminal bud. We know that as long as that shoot is constantly growing, that means that the plant has enough energy to fill all the fruit and to keep new growth happening and to keep sugars moving down to the root system, so we have a constantly growing root system with growing root tips. This is very, very important, and it almost never happens in a conventional system. So this is something that we pay a lot of attention to. So in well-managed plants, we want to always see new growth happening constantly, and because of that, I suspect that we do have enough nutrient supply to keep the new growth at optimal levels all the time. But to really get to the crux of your question, it is absolutely true that if you do not have enough energy to continue supplying new growth, the new growth at that point is no longer the point of, what's the right term, the right way to term it would be, it's no longer the optimal nutrient point where the plant will do everything it can. It will now also sabotage those leaves and move it into the fruit. So we believe, this is a major research initiative that we're working on this next year. We've done some spot checking. This next year, we will begin also checking the leaf that would correlate with the fruit. So on fruit trees, it would be the spur leaf. On corn, it would be the ear leaf right beside the ear. So instead of just doing 2 data points, we're going to begin measuring 3. Old leaf, new growth, and the leaf that is associated with the fruit. So I suspect that we're going to learn that when there is less than optimal nutrition, the new growth is sabotaged at the expense of the fruit leaf. But I don't know that for certain right now.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're cutting you off.